The word Tebe is a loan from the Egyptian naos, casket, shakel for a throne. Interestingly, like the Hebrew word kisi, throne, the Israelites did not use the term Tebe for the Ark of the Covenant, even though it was available to them. It is plausible that the Israelites used the term Aron instead of Tebe or Kisi, throne, because it distinguished the object from a boat while retaining its Cthonic associations. On the Hebrew and Egyptian lexemes, see Helat, page 1678. End of footnote. Nevertheless, some of the bark's other aspects remained meaningful in Israelite priestly culture. It still represented a throne and a footstool, and so it still served as a symbol of the divine presence. It continued to be a sacred object that one could consult for oracles, and its maintenance continued to be the exclusive privilege of the priest. Moreover, there is evidence that it retained the chthonic import of its Egyptian prototype. In part, this comes from the very name that the Israelites gave the object, and Aron, which also and perhaps primarily means coffin. Footnote: the word Aron appears in 2 Kings chapter 12 verses 19 to 16, 2 Chronicles chapter 24 verses 8 to 12, where it is often translated money chest. However, the passage carefully states that the priest Jehoiada took an Aron and bored a hole into its lid, i.e., Dept, literally door. This clarifies that the coffin was repurposed as a coffer. The Akkadian cognate, Arenu, similarly means coffin and cash box. Note also that the Phoenician cognate, Aron, appears on a number of royal memorial inscriptions in reference to heavily Egyptianized Phoenician sarcophagi. If the wood used to build the ark, i.e., Satim acacia, is to be identified with Spina aegyptica, then it is noteworthy that the Egyptians also used it to construct coffins. End of footnote. As such, it appears in the narratives concerning the deaths of the patriarch Jacob, Genesis chapter 50 verses 1 to 14, and his son Joseph, Genesis chapter 50 verse 26, both of whom were embalmed according to Egyptian practice and placed in an Aron. Footnote: Genesis chapter 50 verse 2 states that Joseph ordered his servants and physicians to do the embalming, but they are not identified as Egyptians. End of footnote. Underscoring the chthonic nature of the Aron is its frequent association with threshing floors. See, for example, the account of Joseph's return to Canaan. When they reached the threshing floor of the bramble near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of the bramble, they said, "The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning." That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Misraim, literally the mourning of the Egyptians. Genesis chapter 50 verses 10 and 11. The narrator does not say why the procession stopped here, but readers are forced to wonder, because Jacob was to be buried at Machpelah, Genesis chapter 49, verse 30. Footnote: see for example Sarna, 1989, page 348, who ask, why does the procession stop at just this place, and suggest that the region might have had Egyptian connections. End of footnote. Also unclear is what the Canaanites saw that suggested an Egyptian mourning practice. Footnote: conferred the mourning over the men whom Yahweh slew for looking into the ark in 1 Samuel chapter 6 verses 18 and 19 on the peculiarities of this passage and proposed connection to ark narratives. See Torah Sinai, 1951, pages 275 to 286. End of footnote. While the text mentions the presence of Egyptian officials, they were far outnumbered by the elders of Israel, the household of Joseph and his brothers, and all the members of their father's household. Indeed, Genesis chapter 50 verse 9 states that the group constituted a Ham Mahana Kebed Me'od, an exceedingly large camp. We are told nothing of professional wailing women, nor of people dancing, nor of an opening of the mouth ceremony. Even the length of the event, 7 days, suggests an Israelite mourning practice. Footnote: when Jacob died, the narrator noted that the Egyptians bewailed him for 70 days. Genesis chapter 50 verse 3. Herodotus relates that the body was placed in niter for 70 days. Histories 286. Diodorus Siculus states that the preparation of the body took 30 days and the wailing another 72 days. Histories 191. However, Job and his friends mourned for 7 days. For 1 Chronicles chapter 10 verse 12. End of footnote. Instead, the narrator twice states that the rite took place at a threshing floor. We must consider this as more than a passing reference, for throughout the Near East, threshing floors were regarded as numinous places rich with Cthonic and fertility associations, and thus they were loci for cultic activity. Footnote: Aronov, 1977, supplies a wealth of comparative data on the subject, though his approach is rather Fraserian in orientation. For the cultic use of the threshing floor in Mesopotamia, see Jacobson, 1975, pages 65 to 97. At Ugarit, threshing floors also were tied to mourning and fertility rites and used as sites for divination and summoning the dead. Similar cultic activity took place in the Aegean world. Homeric Hymn to Demeter, page 185 to 189. The threshing floor shared a number of these associations in ancient Israel as well. Thus Gideon sought an oracle by means of divination at a threshing floor. Judges chapter 6 verses 11 to 20. Prophecy and royal judgment also took place there. 1 Kings chapter 22 verses 10 to 11. The latter, even during the period of the Sanhedrin, Aronov, 1977, page 161 to 176, the association of the threshing floor with fertility is suggested also in the book of Ruth, in which Ruth and Boaz have sex at a threshing floor. Ruth chapter 3. See also Hosea chapter 9 verse 1. that some sexual activity took place in or near the Israelite temple is clear by legal and prophetic pronouncements against such acts. See Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 18 and 19, Hosea 4:14, 1 Kings 14:24, 15:12, 22:38 to 47, 2 Kings 23:7, Jeremiah 2:20, 5:7, Ezekiel 16:31, Micah 1 and 7. See also Litauer et al. 1990, pages 15 to 23. And the footnote. However, since the Canaanites identified the mourning ritual as an Egyptian practice, we must ask more specifically what cultic significance the threshing floor had in Egypt. In Egypt, the threshing floor was most widely associated with Osiris and his cult. I need not dwell here on the complex origins and nature of Osiris. Footnote. On the complex history of Osiris and the use of corn mummies, see Griffiths, 1980. End of footnote. Suffice it to say that he was connected inter alia to the resurrection of the dead. Footnote. Though neither Osiris nor the deceased, whom he judged, ever returned to the land of the living, instead they were resurrected in the afterlife. End of footnote. And though the etymology of his name is disputed, it is clear already in the pyramid text that the Egyptians identified him with a divine throne, perhaps as the seed of creation, or the throne of the eye, i.e. sun. The identification of Osiris with new grain is attested abundantly in the mythological corpora, as well as in ritual practices such as the making of corn mummies and Osiris beds. The rites found in the dramatic Ramesseid papyrus and the driving of the calves ritual. Footnote. The verb Hawaii means beating, threshing. See Egbert's 1995 for a comprehensive study of this ritual. Though details mainly come from temples of the Greco-Roman period, the original context for the ritual belonged to Theban festival processions for Osiris in the Ramesseid period, which themselves derive in part from festivals at Memphis. Egbert's 1995, pages 182 to 183. And the footnote. The latter rite was enacted at a number of public festivals. Footnote, including the Sokar Festival, Osiris Mystery, Min Festival, Festival of Dept, Opet Festival, and perhaps also the Festival of the First Month of Summer. See Egbert's 1995, page 412. And the footnote, during which the threshing of grain was interpreted as the dismemberment of Osiris. Footnote, the ritual also involved the royal consecration of 4 myrte chests, reliquaries, that contained 4 differently colored linen bandages for Osiris' mummy. Some texts appear to refer to garments worn by a divine statue, but their use as bandages for the mummification of Osiris is their primary function. The boxes were consecrated by dragging them and beating them with scepters, as one would do to grain. Since the myrte chest represented the cardinal points, the rite enacted the king's dominion over Egypt and his leading of Egypt to the gods. Another rite involved the carrying of two sticks, one topped with a serpent's head. According to one text, each stick represented one half of a severed worm. The ritual was interpreted as driving out the enemy, like a worm which is both a grain eater and corpse eater. The ritual of the Eremit chest preceded that of the driving of the calves, the former rite standing for the mummification of Osiris, and the latter for the protection of his tomb after burial. During the Osiris mystery, these rites were performed at the necropolis over an underground structure in which Osiris effigies were interred. Egberts, 1995, pages 185, 388, 438 to 439. End of footnote. After mourning over Osiris, his members were reunited, reinvigorated, and concealed beneath the threshing floor. Footnote on rituals for assembling Osiris' body. See Egberts, 1995, page 200. Since the mourning rites for Osiris took place at a threshing floor, we perhaps can understand why the Canaanites perceived the Israelites mourning for Jacob as an Egyptian event. And while the narrator does not offer more than the twofold mention of the threshing floor by way of explanation, the references to the embalming of the patriarchs and their interments in an Aron naturally evoke an Egyptian, if not Osirian, subtext. Footnote: in Egyptian mythology and ritual, the living king Horus, in the form of Pharaoh, performs the mourning rites for his father and deceased king Osiris. Interestingly, in Genesis chapter 50, verses 10 and 11, Joseph mourns for his father, the deceased patriarch Jacob. End of footnote. Additional support comes from a number of Talmudic and Midrashic traditions, which Rivka Omer has shown. Footnote: see Omer 2009, pages 107 to 142 for the text paraphrased here, i.e. Exodus, Deuteronomy, and additional evidence. End of footnote. To draw heavily upon Osiris mythology when discussing the burial of Joseph in an Aron and the bringing of his bones back to Canaan. Footnote: there is some discrepancy concerning when Joseph's body was taken from Egypt. Exodus 13:19 states that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Job 46:9 claims that the Israelites took all the bones of Jacob's sons from Egypt, except those of Joseph. Josephus' Antiquities 195 to 200 places the retrieval of Joseph's bones at a much later time. End of footnote. Like Osiris, Joseph is said to be buried among the kings and also in the Nile. According to Midrash, the Egyptians placed Joseph in a metal coffin and buried him in the Nile in order to bless the river with fertility. Later, Moses summons the coffin from the water by using language and paraphernalia suggestive of Egyptian magic. Footnote: that Moses was learned in Egyptian magic appears also in Acts chapter 7 verse 22. Pliny, Mos 1:6, 121, and 124. End of footnote. When the coffin surfaces, it is then compared to a sprouting stalk of reed. Moses then carries the coffin away on his shoulders, much like a sacred bark, with all of Israel in procession. Moreover, like the Egyptian Aron, in which the patriarchs were buried, the Ark of the Covenant was associated with new grain and the threshing floor. Thus we find that the ark's miraculous crossing of the Jordan took place during harvest time. Josh 3:15. Footnote: here the spring barley harvest is meant, since Joshua 5:10 mentions the celebration of the Passover. End of footnote. Later, when the Philistines captured the ark, they placed it in the temple of Dagon, 1 Samuel 1 and 5. Like Osiris, Dagon was associated with new grain and fertility. Footnote: the Hebrew word for grain is Dagan. It appears in conjunction with the threshing floor in Numbers 18:27. The prophet Hosea, too, punfully identifies Dagon with the threshing floor. Hosea 9:1. On Dagon, see Singer 1992, Healy 1999, Feli 2003. On the identification of Dagon as a god of storms, see Green 2003, pages 63 to 72. However, see Shermer 2001 for a more exhaustive treatment of weather gods, which does not include Dagon. If Dagon was in any way identified with Osiris, then the story of the dismemberment of Dagon's statue before the Ark of the Covenant would echo the mythology of Osiris' dismemberment. However, I have found no evidence for the connection, for the view that the dismemberment represents the brutality of warfare as seen in Ugaritic text. See Wiggins 1993. End of footnote. And possessed Cthonic aspects, with titles linking him to rights for the dead. Clearly, the Cthonic aspect of the Israelite Ark and its association with grain were not lost on the Philistines. Footnote: see already Roberts 1972, pages 18 and 19, who argues that this occurs chiefly through his identification with Enlil and the types of sacrifices offered to him, which are identified as sacrifices for the dead. At Turka, his temple was called the Temple of Funerary Ritual, Akkadian Beit Kispi. At Mari, he was given the epithet Bil Palgre, i.e., Lord of the Dead. At Ugarit, too, he received sacrifices to the deceased. Note also the narrator's statement in 1 Samuel 23:1 that the Philistines were fighting at Keilah and plundering its threshing floors. This act led David to seek Yahweh's oracle twice, presumably by way of the ark, as to whether to battle the Philistines. 1 Samuel 23 verses 2 to 4. Moreover, end of footnote. Moreover, when the Philistines found their god dismembered before the ark, they sent it back on a newly constructed wagon. When it reached Beth Shemesh, the villagers were harvesting grain. 1 Samuel chapter 6 verse 15. Later in David's time, the ark was heading to the threshing floor of Nacon. Footnote: the word Nacon might also be read as an adjective meaning prepared right. 1 Chronicles 13:9 reads Kedon instead of Nacon. Tur Sinai 1951, pages 282 to 285, argues that Nacon and Kedon refer to pestilence and affliction. And the footnote: when Yahweh killed a layperson for touching it, 2 Samuel 6 verse 6. Footnote: the ark also was stored in private homes, such as that of Abinadab, whose house was, the narrator twice emphasizes, was located on the hill. 2 Samuel 6 verses 3 to 4, and of Obed-Edom, 2 Samuel 6 verses 10 and 11, whose household prospered on account of the ark. End of footnote. Even when the ark accompanied the Israelites on the battlefield, it was housed in a suke, a temporary booth made from foliage. 2 Samuel 11:11. Footnote: according to Leviticus chapter 23 verses 40 and 41, the foliage included good fruits, palm branches, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. This differs slightly in Nehemiah 8:15, which calls for olive branches, branches of wild olive, myrtle branches, palm branches, and branches of thick trees. The Mishnah clarifies the fruit as a citron. Sukkah 1, 3 and 8, and 1, 3 and 12. The Mishnah's prohibition against using any plants from an Asherah, Sukkah 1, 3 verses 1 to 3 and 5, implies that at one time some people did obtain foliage from an Asherah, thus again attesting to the festival's early fertility associations. End of footnote. This term, of course, lies behind the name for the festival of Sukkoth, which commemorates the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. Note that Nehemiah 8:14 historicizes the festival of Sukkoth as an institution created to remember the Israelites' departure from Egypt. Nevertheless, as 8:17 clarifies, the Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, to that day. I take this gloss to refer not to the festival itself, but to the erection of booths within the courtyards of the temple, 8:16, i.e. an innovation that required historical justification. End of footnote. When David conquered Jerusalem, he purchased the city's main threshing floor after encountering an angel there. 2 Samuel chapter 24, 16 to 17. He then built an altar on the spot in order to avert a plague, which the Septuagint places during the wheat harvest. 2 Samuel chapter 24 verses 15 to 25, and 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 16. Footnote: see the Cage recension of the Septuagint for 2 Samuel 24:15. Araunah, also called Ornan, was a Jebusite and thus an inhabitant of Jebus, i.e. Jerusalem, before David conquered it. Araunah appears to be a Hittite name or title. See Sacy 1921 and Rosen 1955. Wyatt 1985 argues that the Araunah, the name, contains the definite article in 2 Samuel 24:16, was the last Jebusite king, for Ezekiel 16:1. In a lengthy procession amidst music, shouting, frenetic dancing, and burnt offerings, David later would don a priestly linen ephod, lead the ark to the threshing floor, and place it in a tent. Footnote: 1 Chronicles 15:27 adds that David was wearing a robe of fine linen, as were also the Levites, singers, and Kenaniah, the music master. The passage lists the instruments as including a shofar, trumpets, cymbals, loud harps, and liars. End of footnote. David marked the event as a fertility rite by giving the people gifts of bread loaves and cakes of dates and raisins. 2 Samuel 6:19. Footnote: the event was identified as a fertility rite by Smelik, 1992, pages 52 to 53, though I disagree with his dating of the narrative to the post-exilic period. On raisin cakes as a fertility food, see also Hosea 3:1 and Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 5. The biblical writer has inverted the theme of fertility by informing the reader at story's end that David's wife, Michal, died childless. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 23. The same threshing floor became the site on which Solomon built the temple. 1 Kings 6:19, 8:1 through 9, 2 Chronicles 3:1. Moreover, Solomon moved the ark into the temple during the festival of Sukkoth. 1 Kings 8:2, which necessitated processions, dancing, and sacrifices. Footnote: the passage refers to the month by its Canaanite name Ethanim rather than Tishri, the name used after the introduction of the Babylonian calendar. 2 Maccabees chapter 10, 6-8 also informs us that the temple's renovation closely followed the pattern of the festival of ingathering. Sukkoth here is referred to simply as the festival, Hehag. See similarity in 1 Kings 8:65, Ezekiel 45:23, Nehemiah 8:14, and 2 Chronicles 7:8. Ezra 3 verses 1-7 links the dedication of the altar with Sukkoth. On Sukkoth, see Haran 1985, pages 298 to 300. A similar annual harvest festival existed at Shiloh in the period of the Judges. See Judges 21 verses 19-23. Perhaps this explains the ark's trip to Shiloh in 1 Samuel chapter 3 verses 1-31. The Mishnah elucidates the passage in Judges by connecting it to courtship rites. And the daughters of Jerusalem went forth in the vineyards, and what did they say? Young man, lift up your eyes and see who you would choose for yourself as a wife. Set not your eyes on beauty, but set your eyes on family. Ta'anith 4:8. Note also the mention in Judges 9 verse 27 of a vintage feast at Shechem before Yahweh was worshipped there. See the insightful query and response concerning celebration during Sukkoth found in Sukkah 4:4. How was the rite of the palm branch fulfilled on the Sabbath? If the first festival day of the feast fell on a Sabbath, they brought their palm branches to the Temple Mount, and their ministers took them and set them in order on the roof of the portico. But the elders set theirs in a special chamber. The people were taught to say, "Whoever gets my palm branch, let it be his as a gift." The next day they came early, and the ministers threw the palm branches down before them, and the people snatched at them and beat each other. The beatings mentioned here clearly mimic the act of threshing. Compare, e.g., the similar report of R. Jonathan B. Baroka, who noted, "They used to bring palm branches and beat them on the ground at the sides of the altar. And that day was called the day of the branch threshing. Sukkah 4:6. And the footnote. Such references suggest a correlation between the ark's movement and the harvest, and again demonstrate that the Hebrew Aron, whether understood as an Egyptian coffin or the Ark of the Covenant, was intimately connected to threshing floors and their fructifying and chthonic associations. Footnote. Moreover, each of the sanctuaries that the ark visited has chthonic associations and connections to fertility. In 1 Samuel 7:1, the men of Kiriath Jearim moved the ark to the house of a man named Abinadab, which is said to be on a hill. The gloss concerning the hilltop suggests that it was an open space, much like those on which threshing floors were situated. On the connection between threshing floors and high places in ancient Israel, see Aronov, 1977, pages 51 to 52. Note also that we are told that the ark rested there for 20 years, during which the people mourned. In 1 Samuel 7:2, the verb used here usually appears in reference to the mourning for the dead, though the account of the ark at the fall of Jericho contains no reference to grain. The circumambulation of the city 7 times is suggestive of pilgrimage dances and the round shape of the threshing floor. Note the pleonastic etymological connection between Hebrew festival and circle, vault of heaven. It is of note that the Mishnah describes the rituals that took place on the 7th day of Sukkoth as including the blowing of the shofar and a 7-fold circumambulation of the altar with willow branches. Moreover, each of the sanctuaries that housed the ark in the pre-monarchic period has numerous chthonic and fertility associations. At Gilgal, Joshua erected 12 stones to commemorate the ark's miraculous crossing of the Jordan River. Joshua chapter 4 verses 19 to 24. Joshua reinstated the rite of circumcision at Gilgal. Joshua 5:2 to 6. And therefore Yahweh gave him an oracle. Joshua 10:8. Judges 3:19 mentions Gilgal as a place known for its carved idols. Later prophets associate the site with idolatry and temple prostitution, e.g. Hosea 4:15, 9:15, 12:11, Amos 4:4, 5:5. The sanctuary site of Shechem is connected to fertility in that it was set up near an oak tree. Genesis 12:6 and 7, Joshua 24:26, Judges 9:6, Judges 8:33, 9:44 associates Shechem with Baal Berith. Moreover, when Joshua renewed the covenant there, he commemorated the occasion by erecting a stone. Joshua 24:26. Bokim, literally weepers, is given an etiology that connects it to a divine encounter during which the people acknowledged following other gods and wept. Judges 2:1 to 5. This pericope suggests that mourning rites were performed there. Bethel was the site of a divine encounter with the patriarch Jacob, after which he erected a masebah and anointed it with oil. Genesis 28:10 to 19. Hosea 12:4 adds that this event was accompanied by weeping. Bethel was also the site of a mourning rite during which the Israelites wept. Judges 20:26, 21 to 4. Though dating from a later period, 4th century BCE, Papyrus Amhurt 63 attests to bovine imagery at Bethel and associates it with a fusion between Yahweh and Horus. See Nims and Steiner, 1983, 261 to 274. At Shiloh, Joshua cast lots before Yahweh in order to divine which lands belonged to which tribes. Joshua 18:1. Shiloh also is the site of a harvest festival during which young men selected spouses from among the young women who danced in the vineyards. Judges 21:19 to 24. The event was precipitated by the aforementioned mourning of the tribe of Benjamin at Bethel. When the ark stayed at Kiriath Jearim, it was placed on a hilltop. 1 Samuel 7:1 and 2. Initially, it was not an Israelite settlement, but rather a Hivite one. Joshua 9:7 to 17. And at one time it was home to the cult of Baal, as its other name, Kiriath Baal, attests. Joshua 15:9, 15:60, 18:4, and 1 Chronicles 13:6. On Kiriath Jearim and its relationship to Gibeon, see Bleckensop, 1969. Gibeon was the seat of an ancient sanctuary called the Great High Place, 1 Kings 3 and 4. This site too is characterized as numinous. Thus, during the battle at Gibeon, Yahweh halted the motion of the sun, Joshua 10:12, 13, and Joshua allotted it to the Levites, making it a priestly town, 18:25 and 21:17. Later, God appeared and spoke to Solomon at Gibeon, 1 Kings 3:4, and 1 Kings 9:2, 1 Chronicles 1:2 to 7. And the footnote. Possible context for the integration and adaptation of the bark into the Israelite cult. To this point, I have argued that Egyptian sacred barks served as models for the Israelite Ark of the Covenant, and that consequently the two objects share much in common in design, function, and cosmic import. While no particular bark can be singled out as a prototype for the ark's design, the object's associations with death and fertility, its close relationship with the threshing floor, and the mention of the Israelites' practice of Egyptian embalming in conjunction with the Aaron are suggestive of the cult of Osiris. Footnote. Barkay 1994 has shown that Egyptian embalming practices were employed by some within Israel well into the Iron Age. See also Zevit 2001, page 247 and 198, who, citing Barkay's study on embalming in Israel, observes, perhaps some Nilotic mythology accompanied the science, if learned from the Egyptians. End of footnote. Exactly how and when the object became an appurtenance of the Israelite cult is difficult to say, since biblical texts mythologize the ark's creation. Nevertheless, archaeological evidence suggests that the late Bronze Age provided the best opportunity. Footnote. It is not my intention to enter the debate concerning the historicity of the Exodus. The subject has been covered amply by biblical scholars, Egyptologists, and archaeologists, and little by way of consensus has emerged. as can be seen by many of the essays in this volume. Some suggest that it was a plural phenomenon that took place in stages over time. Others view it as a single but much smaller event. Some scholars identify the nascent Israelites with the marauding Apiru, though in more recent years the Shashu have become the comparative group of choice. Dating the Exodus has proved even more difficult, though most positive views place it sometime between the 14th and 12th centuries BCE. In my view, while some of the Proto-Israelites might have lived in settlement communities in Egypt, such as the house of Joseph, the Levites, and perhaps elements of the Benjamite and Judahite tribes, and others might have been among the Shashu, the overwhelming archaeological evidence suggests an indigenous late Bronze Age Canaanite origin for most of the Israelites. In general, I concur with Weinstein, who remarks, if there wasn't historical evidence, it probably consisted of a small number of Semites migrating out of Egypt in the late 13th or early 12th century BC, ultimately settling in southwestern Canaan, where their Egyptian heritage would allow them to melt into the local populace. And the footnote. Because it saw an increased Egyptian presence in the Levant. The Egyptians built garrisons, administrative offices, and Egypto-Canaanite temples to facilitate the collection of grain. Footnote. Temples include those at Aphek, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Beth Shean, Gaza, Jaffa, Lachish, Megiddo, and Tel Abu, Haswam. Note in particular the remark of Nakai, 2001, page 151, that Egypt dominated LB2 Ashdod, and Ashdod's sacred site should be considered Egypto-Canaanite. Over a century ago, the remains of an Egypto-Canaanite temple were discovered north of the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. The finds, which date to the Ramesseid period, included an Egyptian stele dedicated to Osiris. Also discovered in 1975 was a serpent statue. See Wimmer, 1990, page 1073. End of footnote. The Canaanite elites, meanwhile, often sought to emulate Egyptian customs. Of course, they did not adopt Egyptian practices wholesale, but adapted them to fit their own religions, as S.B.Noegel observed. These temples blended Egyptian structural or decorative elements with Canaanite architectural forms. Egyptian ritual and other objects were found alongside Canaanite cultic paraphernalia. Iconography often exhibited qualities of synthesis rather than exclusivity, but in general the gods and goddesses of Canaan prevailed. Footnote. A similar process of integration and adaptation in which the foreign elements did not compromise the identity and worship of the local gods obtains in the Iron Age, when Egyptian interest and influence shifted to the Phoenician world. As Giveon, 1978, page 31 remarks, in spite of the strong influence of Egyptian culture on the Canaanites in general, and Byblos in particular, the fundamental religious concepts of the Egyptians were not copied or even adopted by the peoples of Western Asia. It is only the iconography of the Egyptians which was used as a means of expressing the religious beliefs of the Canaanites. In the process of the transfer, Egyptian pictorial concepts were changed in varying degrees. the changes being due sometimes to a lack of understanding of their real meaning and sometimes to the need to use similar pictographs to express different ideas. And the footnote. The late Bronze Age also saw movements of Canaanites and Egyptians in both directions, and it is at this time that the Merneptah Stele records the earliest written evidence for Israelites in Canaan. This was a formative and flexible period in the history of Israelite religion, as it also saw the gradual fusion of the Canaanite god El with Yahweh. Footnote. In some circles, this also led to identifying Asherah as Yahweh's consorts. See Olian, 1988, pages 38 to 61. On the syncretism of El and Yahweh, see Smith, 2003, who argues that El was first identified as the God of the Exodus, and that El was identified with Yahweh in pre-monarchic period. End of footnote. However, of particular relevance here are a great many seals, scarabs, and other objects found in Canaan, which Othmar Keel has shown attest to the Canaanites' fascination with Memphis and its god Ptah. Footnote. According to Keel, 2006, page 248, this process began already at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. The scarabs previously discussed here thus testify to the Middle Bronze Age Canaanites' fervor and enthusiasm for Egyptian culture in general and for the god of Memphis in particular. The predilection for this god can be explained by trade connections with Memphis and by the fact that many of the Canaanites coming to Egypt during the 13th and 15th dynasties were craftsmen. See also the 12th century BCE ivory plaques from Megiddo inscribed in honor of a Canaanite temple musician named Kerkur, who had been trained at Memphis and was serving the court of Ashkelon. Wimmer, 1990, pages 1091 to 1093, and Lipke, 2011. Florian Lipke has informed me by personal communication, April 15, 2013, of a number of additional scarabs and seals found in the southern Levant that feature Ptah iconography, including those from Abu Hawam, Aksib, a good portion from Tel Agul and Akko, Ashkelon, at least 5 from Beth Shean, as well as Dur Balah, Dotan, Ekron, and Samij, Tel Eshtori, 13 from Tel Farah, 5 from Tel Gama, 1 from Gath, 1 from Geriza, 3 from Gezer, and 1 from Tel Hesi. In Jordan, there's 1 from Amman, 1 from Tel Deir Allah, and 1 cylinder seal from there as well. See Zechi, 1996, for the spread of the cult of Osiris after the 11th century BCE. End of footnote. Also known by his syncretic name, Ptah Sokar Osiris. On the fusion of the 3 deities already during the Old Kingdom, see Gabala and Kitchen, 1969. Note that unlike some of the other Egyptian festivals, the festival of the mystery of Osiris was celebrated throughout the country. Teeter, 2011, page 59. Ptah Sokar Osiris was at once the creator, the son, and judge of the underworld, and he was the patron god of craftsmen. Like Yahweh, he created the world by fiat, and was a god of justice who rewarded the righteous and punished sinners with death. Keel, 2006, pages 258 to 259, discusses four scarabs that feature Ptah standing before Ra and Osiris in the form of two birds. He argues that the items demonstrate a knowledge of the concepts represented in the Memphite theology. C. Cope, 1965, cited by Keel, 2006, page 261. With Schlegel, 1980, Keel dates the Memphite theology to the reign of Ramses II. It is in this context of Egyptian-Canaanite exchange, Israelite religious syncretism, and Levantine interest in Ptah Sokar Osiris that I envision the Israelites' adaptation of the bark. Those features, functions, and associations that the ark shared with this prototype represented facets of a shared taxonomy, aspects that made sense in both Egyptian and Israelite religious contexts before the object was integrated. Footnote. Note that Yahweh also was connected with horses in his capacity as a solar deity, e.g. 2 Kings 23:11, Habakkuk 3:8, Malachi 4:2, Psalms 19:5-7, and 84:12. C. Alstrom, 1984, pages 22 and 23, and Staley, 1985. Thus, the ark retained its significance as a throne and footstool, and as the symbol of God's presence, and it continued to be a source of oracles. By calling the object an Aron, the Israelites retained the ark's Cthonic associations that resonated with the priestly conception of El Yahweh as a creator God to whom the first fruits are offered. Leviticus 23, verses 9-14. Footnotes. Interestingly, Exodus 25 portrays Yahweh as a God of craftsmen. After giving Moses detailed instructions for building the ark, he personally selects the craftsmen and fills them with his spirit and wisdom. Exodus 35:30, 36:7. Note too that the word firmament, which God created to support the heavens in Genesis 1:6, derives from a root whose basic meaning is to beat out metal. End of footnote. On the other hand, those features that did not resonate with the priestly conception of God were refashioned or reconceptualized. Thus, the object's connection to a boat was obscured by referring to it as a throne and footstool, and by naming it Aron, which suggested its use as a coffin. Footnote. Other cults apparently were more receptive to the notion of a God who can die and be resurrected. Such might account for shared aspects of the Levantine cults of Osiris, Baal, and Adonis, of which scholars have long been aware. Strange, 2004, page 350, has argued that the Osiris cult was refracted in or synchronized with the cults of Baal and Adonis. Redford, 1992, pages 43 and 44, similarly argues that the comparative study of Osiris, Baal, and Adonis has fallen into disfavor largely because scholars have tried to distance themselves from the earlier methodological pitfalls that beset the works of Sir James Frazer. According to Redford, scholars have erred too much on the side of caution and have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. For a more recent critical treatment of the topic, see Medinger 2001. The spread of the cult of Osiris throughout the Mediterranean world is certainly in evidence during the Greco-Roman period. See in particular the host of later myths involving Osiris and or accounts involving floating chests observed by Plutarch and others and discussed by Harley 1949, Griffiths 1980. Of note is the depiction of the cult of Osiris on a fresco at Pompeii, which shows a temple devoted to Isis. Within the temple is a naos, which is constructed from the disassembled parts of an Osiris coffin. Inside the naos is painted a bark of Osiris. The fresco shows that the bark of Osiris could be reimagined in other ways outside of Egypt. For an image of the fresco, see Mergelbach 2001, page 505. End of footnote. These labels served a dual purpose. As a throne without a statue, the ark visually conveyed the aniconic nature of Yahweh. See Medinger 1995. As a casket without a body, it ingrained the notion of Yahweh as a God who cannot die. Concomitantly, the disposition of the tablets into the Aron replaced any suggestion of a divine judge of the underworld with objects that represented Yahweh's role as divine judge and lawgiver. Footnote. According to the Hebrew Bible, Aaron's rod stood near the ark. Numbers 17:1. Though a tradition found in the New Testament, Hebrews 9:4, places the rod inside the ark. Nevertheless, much like the ark itself, the wonders ascribed to it, including its transformation into a serpent, Exodus 7:10, and its blossoming and production of almonds, Numbers 17:8, convey a sense of chthonic power and fertility. Its transformation into a serpent has parallels in Egyptian magical praxis. See Noegel 1997. The parallels to Egyptian magic and the comparative evidence gathered in this essay suggest that the Levites possessed at least some knowledge of Egyptian religious practices. It long has been observed that several individuals connected to the early Israelite priesthood possessed Egyptian names, including Asir, Hophni, Pinhas, Or, Merari, and of course Moses. See already North 1928, pages 63 and 64. Some have opined that the name Aaron too is Egyptian. See Spencer 1992 and Muchiki 1999. If one concedes that the Levites possessed knowledge of Egyptian religion, might it also be that the solar bark's encounter with the great serpent Apep informs the Israelite conception of the great serpent Leviathan, also called Tanin? Not only is this creature identified with the Pharaoh, Ezekiel 29:3 and 32:2, but its dismemberment by Yahweh is credited with enabling the Israelites to cross the Red Sea, Isaiah 51:9 and 10. In Exodus 7:10, Aaron's staff becomes a tanin before devouring the serpent staffs of the Egyptian magicians. Moreover, Rittner 1993, page 165 to 167, has discussed how Egyptian priests employed rituals to ensure the safe nightly passage of the solar bark. These rites involved paralyzing Apep by severing, burning, or otherwise destroying an effigy of the serpent. No such rite is attested in the Hebrew Bible. However, the many references to the great serpent as an enemy of Yahweh and the role that priests played in maintaining cosmic order through ritual suggest that perhaps we should read more into the etymological connection between the priestly tribe of Levi and the Leviathan. The etymological connection was first suggested to me by the late Cyrus H. Gordon. As many have pointed out, Psalms 74, 13 and 14 refers to the beast as having multiple heads and thus more akin to the multi-headed creature Aten in Ugaritic text, and artistic representations from Arslan, Tash, and Diyala. Nevertheless, some representations of chaos serpents in Egypt also have multiple heads. See, e.g., the panel in the tomb of Tutmosis III that depicts the falcon-headed Sokar overpowering a many-headed chaos serpent in a cave during the 5th hour of the Amduat. Moreover, the aforementioned passage in Psalm 74 is followed rather fittingly with chaotic water and solar imagery in verses 15 and 16 with "You broke the springs and the torrents, you dried ever-flowing streams. To you belongs day and also night. You have prepared the light and the sun." I also note that Isaiah 27 opens by referencing the punishment of Leviathan, verse 1, and concludes with Yahweh threshing his enemies, verse 12. Additional evidence for the Levitical association with serpents appears in Numbers 21, 8 and 9, in which Moses cures the people of snake bites by fashioning a bronze serpent, and in the latter mention that the priest had allowed the item to be venerated until Hezekiah destroyed it. 2 Kings 18 and 4. End of footnote. Thus, Yahweh became the ruler of the entire cosmos from the heavens to the underworld. In Isaiah 66:1, Yahweh declares, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where will my resting place be?" If the word Ares here means underworld, as it does elsewhere in the Bible, Job 10:21 to 26, 22, Psalms 139:15, Isaiah 44:23, Jonah 2:6, and in Ugaritic and Akkadian text, then the passage also connects the Kaporeth, lid throne, with the heavens, and the Aaron, ark footstool, with the underworld, since heaven and underworld constitute a more apt merism and a better case of cosmic symmetry than heaven and earth. One naturally might question whether Ares means underworld in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That Ares here might mean underworld is suggested later in Genesis 7:11, which describes the cosmic collapse in a way that reverses the processes of creation. Thus Yahweh rains down with the reservoir of a heavenly water and ushers up the fountains of the deep. And threshing became an idiom for the judgment and dismemberment of Yahweh's enemies. By the time of the early Israelite monarchy, the ark, like the God Yahweh, was perceived as entirely Israelite. though memory of its origins likely remained and required negotiation. Footnote: the process of innovation and negotiation find an apt parallel in the establishment of temples at Dan and Bethel under Jeroboam I. To decentralize the religious and political authorities in Jerusalem, Jeroboam set up golden calves in the temples and told the people, "Behold, O Israel, your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt." 1 Kings 12:28. Jeroboam had strong support from Egypt and even lived there for a time. 1 Kings 11:40 and 12:2. On the complex relationship between the account of Jeroboam's calves and Exodus 32, see Knoppers 1995 and Russell 2009, pages 41 to 43. Note that 2 Chronicles 13:8 appears to understand the calves as a war standard and thus mobile like the Ark of the Covenant. As Russell 2009 27 to 30 points out, Jeroboam I's use of bovine imagery might reflect Egyptian, Syrian, or Mesopotamian influence, or the renovation of older imagery associated with El, to which Yahweh was fused. In my view, the power of icons lies in their ability to communicate on multiple levels to multiple audiences. A bovine image could have served this purpose. And the footnote: hence, it was integrated retroactively into the national epic of the Exodus and intimately tied to Egypt and the first harvest festival. Footnote: the Exodus stories appear to have originated in the northern kingdom of Israel and to have been integrated into Judahite historiographical tradition at a later time. See Hoffman 1989 and Naaman 2011. The construction of the ark with acacia suggests that the ark's origins were south of the kingdom of Israel. End of footnote. This gave the object an etiology that distinguished it from Egyptian religious practice. Footnote: on the theory that the ark narratives serve as an etiology for its use in the Jerusalem cult, see already Rost 1926, though Rost does not discuss parallels to Egyptian barks. End of footnote. One that served the needs of the priesthood, the royal house, and the national epic. As the centerpiece of the Israelite sanctuary, the Ark of the Covenant stood as the symbolic presence of Yahweh and his legitimation of the Levitical priesthood. As the Lord of hosts who rides upon the cherubim, the ark legitimated the royal house and its wars. As an Egyptian object transformed and detuned, it offered visual and literary validation of the Exodus. End of essay. References: